These are the recordings for Chapter 4 on tissues. The study of tissues is called histology, just like the study of cells is called cytology. So make sure that you know that word histology right here. Histology means the study of tissues. And if you remember, tissues are groups of similar cells. There are 4 basic tissue types in humans, and that is epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So make sure you know the name of each of the 4 tissue types, and then we're going to cover them in more detail. But the 4 tissue types are epithelial, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Now, we will spend more time on epithelial and connective simply because we have chapters on muscle and nervous tissue. So epithelial and connective we will definitely devote a lot more time to in this chapter. This is just an overview of the 4 basic types. Nervous and muscle tissue is pretty easy, and you probably are already familiar with those. Nervous tissue is found in the brain and the spinal cord, and then the nerves that extend from the brain and the spinal cord. We call those cranial and spinal nerves. So the brain, the spinal cord, and nerves. And then muscle tissue includes 3 types of muscle. So the one that we're most familiar with is skeletal muscle, the ones that, when we go to the gym, we're exercising those muscles like biceps and triceps and your leg muscles, arm muscles, all of that, facial muscles. Skeletal muscle is muscle that attaches to bone and causes movement. But then there's also the heart is composed of muscle tissue called cardiac muscle. And then there's smooth muscle that lines our blood vessels and our digestive tract and our airways. And so we'll talk about the 3 different types and kind of compare the 3 different muscle tissue types. But then the 2 we're going to spend the most time on are epithelial and connective. And epithelial tissue basically forms linings and coverings. So the skin, at least the outer layer of the skin, the epidermis, is epithelial tissue. But now underneath the epidermis is the dermis, and the dermis is actually connective tissue. So we have epithelial tissue forms coverings and linings. So every organ, let's just say the heart, for example, the outside of the heart is covered in epithelial tissue. And then on the inside of the heart, the lining of the inside is also epithelial tissue. So the outside of our blood vessels and the inside are lined with epithelial tissue. So coverings and linings, and then glands are composed of epithelial tissue. Connective tissue it's very diverse for one thing, but connective tissue is going to consist of bones, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, fat tissue, and then just the tissue that's underneath of our skin is a lot of that's adipose tissue, but some of it is loose connective tissue, what we call loose connective tissue. So there's different examples. Blood is actually a type of connective tissue. So we're going to skip this part on how to stain tissue and then go on to section 4.2 on epithelial tissue. You want to make sure you focus on once we start talking about the different types of epithelial tissue, is understanding basically the composition or what each type is made of. And then so to be able to describe each tissue type and where it's located in the body. That's basically how I want you to focus, because my questions almost always ask like examples of where it's located in the human body. So epithelial tissue, or sometimes we just call it epithelium, mostly consist of cells that are actually lined up together, forming a sheet of cells. So they're not really surrounded by a lot of like fluid or ground substance. Is mostly, the tissue is mostly cells that are kind of packed together. So there are two main forms of epithelial. There is coverings and linings, like I talked to you about. And then there's glandular epithelium, and that is the tissue found in our endocrine and exocrine glands. So they give the example of the salivary glands, but any glands really. Characteristics of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue has polarity. And what I mean by that is there's like a top side or an apical surface, and then there's a basal surface. There's a surface that's exposed. It's either exposed to body fluid or is exposed to the air in the case of skin. And then there's the surface that's attached to something underneath it. So there's an apical and a basal surface. Let me see if I can show you what I mean. So these are the cells that line our respiratory tract, line our airways. You can see this soft, fuzzy layer of cilia here that helps to sweep mucus and trapped particles out of, up and out of our lungs. I think that's what this is. It almost looks like it could be, yeah, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so in this space, it looks like the tissue that lines our airways. And then when you get here, it kind of looks like the tissue that lines our intestine. But anyway, it doesn't really matter, does it? What I'm trying to teach you, it doesn't matter. But no, I'm pretty sure this is the epithelial tissue that lines our airways. And so the apical surface is the top surface here that contains cilia or little hairs. And you can kind of see that the cilia look kind of fuzzy or blurry. But anyway, this is the apical surface, and it's exposed to basically the inside of our airway, the lumen or the space inside of our trachea and our bronchial tubes, but the basal surface is the part that's attached to the underlying connective tissue. So that's what's meant by polarity. And then there are junctions or specialized contacts that connect the cells to one another. They're called cell junctions. There's tight junctions, and there's desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, gap junctions. The epithelial tissue, almost every example of epithelial tissue in the body has connective tissue underneath it. So it's supported or connective tissue supports or underlies the epithelial tissue. And then epithelial tissue is avascular, but it is innervated. In other words, it is attached to a nerve. It does receive nerve impulses from the nervous system, but avascular meaning that there's no blood vessels directly in epithelial tissue. Now, blood vessels can come all the way up to the edge of the epithelial tissue, but there's none actually in the tissue. And then regeneration, that epithelial tissue, of course, we know this because we know that we're constantly shedding skin cells and replacing them. So polarity just means that the epithelial cells have an apical surface, which is the side that is exposed to a surface or a cavity. It's either open to opens up into a body cavity, or it's exposed to the air maybe. And then the basal surface is attached to the basal lamina, which is an adhesive sheet that holds the basal surface of epithelial cells to underlying cells. So the basal is the lower attached surface, and the apical surface is unattached. All right, then epithelial tissue has special contacts, like tight junctions, which attach the cells to one another and form a tight seal so that fluids can't leak through. And desmosomes are very, very strong button-like connections. Or I like to think of desmosomes remind me of like a spot weld. So two sheets of metal have been welded together at one spot so that they won't so that they won't separate, but it's just to hold the pieces of metal together. So it's not to form a tight seal so that no fluids will leak out. It's just so that those two pieces of metal will be held together. So desmosomes are button-like attachments that are very, very strong. Tight junctions are just more about sealing the connection between the two cells so that fluids can't leak. Then we have connective tissue underneath that reinforces the epithelial tissue. And it says there is a basement membrane, and it says that is made up of the basal and reticular lamina. So the base, oh, okay. You know what? I just learned something. I knew epithelial tissue always had a basement membrane that lines the bottom of the tissue where it connects with connective tissue, but I didn't realize the basement membrane is connective tissue. So something I knew that I learned. The basement membrane that's underneath the that supports the basal side of the epithelial tissue is connective tissue. It's composed of connective tissue. Now, there is a homeostatic imbalance, and it starts: cancerous epithelial cells are not contained by the basement membrane boundary like other cells. In other words, cancerous cells can penetrate that boundary and invade underlying tissues, and then they can spread. Okay, and we said that epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels, so it's avascular, but it is supported by nerve fibers. Some of those nerve fibers are receptors, like touch receptors for touch and pressure and temperature and pain. Then epithelial tissue is very, very highly capable of regenerating because it's constantly being shed and replaced. Now, this is how we describe or classify epithelial tissue. We either call it simple or stratified. So epithelial tissue is either simple, that means it has a single layer of cells, or stratified. The word stratified means layers. So if it's called stratified, it has either two or more cell layers. So stratified epithelial tissue is more like for protection. And then whether it's simple or stratified, you also name the cells based on their shape. So the cells are either flat, and we call those squamous cells, or they're box-like, and those are cuboidal cells, or they're tall, and those are columnar. So you either have squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. So then you put the two names together. For example, what we're looking at here is the two different types of squamous tissue. So up top, you're looking at simple squamous because you have a single row of flat cells. And see the pink underneath it? That is your basement membrane. So that's what I meant by when I was talking about basement membrane. So the basal surface of those simple squamous cells is attached to the basement membrane underneath, and that is a type of connective tissue. All right, so we have a simple squamous, and then we have stratified squamous. In stratified squamous, you can see that the closer that the cells are to the top, the flatter they are. The ones on the bottom row, or the basal, these are actually called basal cells. These basal cells are actually more cuboidal in shape. But we do know that this bottom picture is showing layers, many layers of squamous cells, mostly squamous cells anyway. And so that is stratified squamous. So we have simple and stratified squamous. Here's a picture of the cell shape. Flat is squamous, box-like is cuboidal, and very tall is columnar. So simple squamous epithelial tissue is going to be a single layer of flat cells. And this is actually the thinnest, most delicate tissue in the body. And there are two examples that have special names. So the endothelium of our blood vessels. That is the inner lining of our blood vessels. It is the part that directly contacts the blood inside the blood vessel. So it's the lining of lymphatic vessels, blood vessels, and the heart. The inside lining of lymphatic vessels, blood vessels, and the heart is called the endothelium, and that is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And mesothelium lines serous membranes, and that is composed of the serous membranes are the membranes that line the heart and the lungs and then the abdominal organs. There are 3 different serous membranes, but mesothelium is found in the serous membranes, and it is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So what we're looking at here is a microscopic image where you can see the simple squamous epithelial tissue is very, very thin. This is a picture of the air sacs of the lungs. And the air sacs of the lungs are very small. There's millions of them, and they're microscopic. And all of them are formed from this very, very thin, delicate tissue, simple squamous epithelial tissue. And that is usually the example that you see is the air sacs of the lungs. When we talk about simple squamous, is we typically use the air sacs or the alveoli of the lungs for our example. So that's simple squamous epithelial, and then we find simple cuboidal forming the kidney tubules. That's a single layer of cuboidal cells, and we see that in the kidney tubules. And here you see a picture under the microscope of, I like this one in the middle, because it shows you a cross-section through one of the kidney tubules. Kidney tubules are called nephrons. And each kidney has millions of nephrons, and each nephron produces a certain amount of urine. It filters a certain amount of blood and produces a certain amount of urine. But if you can see, this is a cross-section through a tube. The white part inside is like the space in the tube because the tube is kind of flat. It's not opened up. But this is the space in the tube, and then you can see all the cells that form that tube are thicker, a little bit taller than squamous cells, but they're not columnar. Okay, and you can also, it's a little bit blurry, but this is the lumen or the space inside the tube, and then you see the cells that form the tube. So simple cuboidal is going to form the kidney tubules. There are other examples, but this is the best example of where we have simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Then we have simple columnar, which is a single layer of tall cells, and these line the intestine. And a lot of times they are covered on the apical surface, not with cilia. It may look like cilia, but this is not cilia. These are folds in the apical surface, in the plasma membrane of these cells, and those folds are called microvilli. So it's a single layer of columnar cells that bear microvilli on their apical surface, and the microvilli increase the surface area for the absorption of nutrients, which is what these cells do, basically, is absorb nutrients. They can absorb more nutrients with microvilli. But you can see they're tall cells, and it's a single layer of tall cells. So simple columnar we find in the intestine, in most of the digestive tract, from the stomach to the rectum. And then we have what looks like, and this is why I hesitated when I saw that tissue earlier in the slides, and I couldn't really for sure know if it was the lining our respiratory tract or our digestive tract. And that is because that tissue looked a little blurry compared to this. This you can clearly see these cells are lined with cilia, and when you look at them under the microscope, they look like they're layered. Looks like many layers of cells, right? That are all, this is the bottom or the basement membrane, but it looks like there's different layers of cells in here. And then in between these cells, you have these cells called goblet cells that produce mucus. So pseudostratified means false layers. It means they look like layers, but they're not. So it's actually just a single layer of cells. but they appear layered because they're different sizes, they're different heights, and they have their nucleus is like in different places. So when you look at these cells under the microscope, they look like layers of cells. But it's really every single cell, if you could see it clearly, every cell is attached to the basement membrane. So it's actually just a single layer of cells. Single layer of cells that appear layered, and then, so we call this tissue pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. And the best example of where we find it is lining the airways, lining the trachea and the upper respiratory tract, so your bronchi. And they are covered on the apical surface with cilia. And what the cilia does is it sweeps the mucus and the trapped particles and stuff that could harm you or cause infection in your lungs. It sweeps all of that up and out of your lungs so that your lungs don't get infected.